to think that just a couple seasons ago, TCU was in the national championship game under their first season with Sonny Dykes. And, all things considered, they just feel like a big wild card this season, especially because, you have to love what they're doing on offense. I mean, that's really any team coached by Sonny Dykes, right? I mean, you can go back and think about his tenures at whether it was Louisiana Tech, University of California, or most recently before that, SMU. And, he's had multiple seasons where his offenses have been performing top 10 in the country, at least statistically speaking. And his Achilles heel has always been, at least defensively. I know when he had that run in 2022, I mean, even when they beat Michigan to go to the national championship game, that game ended up being 51-49. And if we've kind of learned anything from teams such as TCU, it's that in order to win a national championship game, you have to be able to play defense and you have to be able to recruit on a high level. And that's something that TCU, quite frankly, has been doing in the past couple seasons. At least going into this season, they have the number one ranked recruiting class in all of the Big 12, which to me is pretty telling, especially when they have 31 commits coming in, only 9 transfers. They've been really consistent at, especially honing in on the state of Texas, right? 75% of their class is within state, which I think is a phenomenal statistic. And, it's very telling in terms of the direction that this program is heading into. And, I think of some of the quote unquote blue chip guys that I'm really excited about. I would first give a shout out to Terry Shellon. He's a wide receiver, 6'2", 200 pounds, 3-star kid. I think if you give it a couple years, I think he could be a guy that's going to be an immediate contributor for them. And also Chad Woodfork as well. He's a edge rusher, 6'4", 214, somebody that I think if he beefs up a little bit and continues to develop, I think he's going to be a kid that we're talking about in a season or two for this team as well. And, of course, it goes without saying that we got to talk about Josh Hoover a little bit, right? He's an exciting kid. He's a gunslinger. He's got a cannon of an arm. He can find receivers all throughout the field. He's going to attack you vertically. Almost 4,000 passing yards last season with 27 touchdown passes and only his first season as a starter. So it just kind of makes you think to yourself, hey, as long as he doesn't have the sophomore slump, TCU could be an exciting team to watch. Now, granted, I think there are a couple question marks on this team that definitely has me pretty concerned. I think first and foremost, we got to talk about the wide receiver room a little bit. Josh Hoover is going to be going into this season without his top 3 receivers from a year ago. And that's definitely something to be concerned about as well. Just given in this day and age of college football, yes, everybody's transferring, everybody's going to different teams, et cetera, et cetera. There is a part of you that also kind of says to yourself, hey, just having any sort of continuality on your program is just such a big deal. And they're going to have to rely on some younger kids this year. I'm really excited about Jordan Dwyer, who's a junior. He's coming in from the Idaho Vandals. And, he's definitely a kid that I think he's not necessarily going to be their number 1 guy, but he could be, their number 2 or their number 3, depending on kind of how their depth chart ends up coming about. And also a guy that I think you could probably slot in as your slot guy, or just kind of situational moments too. And granted, they also have Eric McAllister too, who I think is obviously their number 1 receiver, somebody that I think Josh Hoover is going to be relying upon heavily this year. And I think it's also going to come down to how well their rushing attack is. Now, obviously, no Sonny Dykes team is ever going to lead any sort of statistic in rushing the football. And, he's primarily run a spread offense all throughout his coaching career. However, there's definitely a part of you that needs to see a little bit more progress, at least running the ball. And I just mean that in the sense of, at the end of the day, Josh Hoover had 11 interceptions last year. So it is worth asking yourself, hey, if some of these Big 12 defenses end up being able to put a lot of pressure on Josh Hoover, is he able to make those decisions? And most importantly, are they going to be a big enough threat to be able to run the ball to the point where it at least doesn't make teams second guess in terms of, hey, maybe they're not just going to rush every play. Maybe we do have to take their rushing attack just a little bit more seriously. Now, granted, like I said just 2 seconds ago, they're not leading any team in the country in rushing. They're not going to sit there and, set the world on fire in terms of all that. However, it's something that they have to tap into, right? Because at the end of the day, TCU does deserve a lot of credit for what they've done. I mean, even when you go into the era of Gary Patterson, who I think is a phenomenal coach, and quite frankly, I think it's a shame that he kind of got ran out of town there in Fort Worth. But TCU remains the only team that has played in all 6 major bowl games since the college football championship exception in 2014. So I think that's pretty telling in terms of some of the overall teams that they were able to build at TCU. Now, granted, I think they definitely have some advantages in terms of being able to provide for NIL and all those things too, but at least consistently year after year, they are just simply really valuing their recruiting a hell of a lot more than a lot of other teams are in the Big 12. And last year they were ranked 35th according to On3. And this year they are just shy of getting a top 25 class and for the first time in a long time. They're 26th this year. So it's definitely worth mentioning that I think TCU is kind of itching their way towards being a team that we kind of talk about every year being in kind of that Big 12 contention. But at least whether it was a Sonny Dykes team or even a Gary Patterson team to some degree, it was always the defense that kind of held them back. And before I kind of get into that, I mean, I think it's worth at least pointing out a little bit, talking about, second-year defensive coordinator Andy Avallanos, who, he was the head coach at UNLV, well-experienced guy, really a smart guy. And, I think there has to be at least a little sense of optimism that this defense can at least turn around a little bit. I think everybody kind of knew that there was going to be some growing pains, at least on the defensive side of the ball, particularly on the pass rush element of it too, because I think what was really missing from this TCU team, and I think that's something that I think Sonny Dykes and this coaching staff really kind of honed in on, what was really missing last year was a team that had depth. And as the injuries kind of piled up a little bit, and as things kind of progressed, I think they really realized, hey, there are definitely some deficiencies on a bunch of different positions on the field. And if we can we don't necessarily have to go out and get, 6 5-star kids. If we can just grab a handful of 4 stars and some kids that we can develop internally, this could be a really exciting program to kind of put together too. Now, granted, the Horned Frogs last year, they allowed an average of 24.6 points a game, which compared to 2023, it's moving in the right direction. So I think it's worthwhile to at least give them some credit for what they've done. And also too, you have to be excited about some of the contributors that they're going to have back, such as all Big 12 safety Bud Clark, along with safety senior linebackers Nnamdi Abazar and Caleb Orr. So when you think of those 2 guys coming in, and you also have Bud Clark, and you also have a handful of other contributors too, such as Devon Deal, who's going to be an edge guy, and I think somebody that they're really going to have to rely upon in terms of being able to get pressure on the quarterback. It could be a recipe for this TCU team to really kind of have a comeback season, especially that they went 5-7 last year. And I think a lot of people thought that they were going to do a little bit better than they did. Now, granted, like I said before, there's still questions at the wide receiver position. I think a lot of TCU fans kind of gave the offensive line a little bit more criticism than they probably deserved. I think at least in terms of pass protection, I think they were a little bit better than people kind of gave them credit for. Now, granted, there were some issues in terms of penalties last season and not being able to win some close games here and there. But at the same time, too, those are things that don't necessarily have to translate year after year after year. I think a lot of people would agree, and I would agree with this too, that Sonny Dykes is the right guy for this job. I think he's a phenomenal spokesperson for the program. I think he's somebody that I think is ultimately a good voice for college football, in the sense that every time I've heard him talk in an interview, or every time I've heard him talk about this program, I think he is the type of coach that genuinely has the best interests of these kids. And I think he's somebody that these kids want to play for. I think it's telling how well that they've done consistently in recruiting over the past couple of seasons. I think it's telling in terms of some of the in-state guys that they're getting to come in, especially since Texas is one of the most brutally competitive states in terms of pipelines to recruit in all of college football. And he deserves some credit for that. And granted, they're going to have it's going to be some tough sledding this year in terms of at least scheduling wise, because aside from your FCS game versus Abilene Christian, there aren't really any sort of absolute gimme games on the schedule. I mean, unless you want to argue that Houston in late November counts as a kind of a gimme game, you got to be a little bit curious about this in the sense that, I got the September 1st game versus North Carolina etched on my calendar because everybody's going to be talking about Bill Belichick's debut at Chapel Hill. So I think to myself, if TCU can come out swinging and just put this North Carolina defense on the ropes, I think all of a sudden we're going to be talking about TCU in a completely different narrative than what we're talking about right now. Because as I see it now, do I think TCU is good enough to be in a bowl game this year? Absolutely. Do I think they're going to be a team that we're probably going to be talking about in the Big 12 championship contention? I think they still have some missing pieces on that side of the football in order to get there, even though they definitely do have some talent there and they are kind of piecing it together. It could be one of those seasons where, hey, we're not necessarily winning the Big 12 championship this year, but we're playing teams like SMU really tough. We're playing teams like Arizona State pretty tough. We're showing the state of Texas that we are legitimate and that we are putting funds in the NIL. And we are going to be a threat, and we're going to be back in the national title picture again, hopefully sooner rather than later. So at the very least, I imagine this TCU team to be very competitive this season in class, ultimately in a season that's going to be really difficult too. That when you have one of the best signing classes in the entire league, when you're building an NIL to keep the kids that they value, and when they're able to build depth and be able to bring in guys that kind of build into that culture, it's a recipe for success. But when you face teams like North Carolina, SMU, Arizona State, Colorado, Kansas State, and you have BYU at the end of the season in a road game, it definitely is going to be an intriguing storyline